Good evening, everyone. I'm John OLoughlin, and welcome to McDuff Lives. And tonight I'm very excited to start this new book. I I noticed it maybe 2 weeks ago and immediately said, I've got to get this book. A couple of people have since recommended it to me, and it came about 3 days ago. I've made it through the first 100 pages or so, and so much in it that I want to share. But I know I'm not going to be able to read the whole book just because it's a very uh, densely packed, full of information. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the first couple of chapters, not because there isn't great stuff in them, but mainly because we've covered this material before. We've covered it in The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer, which is a book that I'll be reviewing on Wednesday night. So for many reasons, this has led me to the decision to skip ahead to chapter 3 of the book, which is called Dulles, DeMohrenschildt, and Oil. Now, because we talked about George DeMohrenschildt in depth a couple of nights ago, I thought it would be particularly helpful to just go ahead to this chapter and fill in what is going to be a much more detailed account of how Allen Dulles met George DeMohrenschildt, how they both had an interest in Indonesia, and of course, how oil has been the driving factor in all of these events of the 20th century, driven, of course, by the Rockefellers and their allies and the banks. So you remember the scenario where John F. Kennedy comes into office at a time when the Bay of Pigs has been planned, but he's not told about it. He gets some hints that he knows that there's some Cuban exiles that are getting together and that are hoping to do something, but he doesn't have the specific plan that Allen Dulles has held confidential from him until after the event actually is underway. And then, well, what happened, we've been over it quite a few times, and not to say that we know the final word on it, but we do know that the result was that Kennedy felt betrayed by Dulles, fired Dulles, Bissell, and General Cabell. And as a result of that, the formation of United Technologies and Bissell basically taking what they were doing private, but working through their remaining contacts within the CIA and the federal State Department mainly to keep doing what they were doing all along. Well, I got ahead of our story, and I want to get back to where this actually picks up in 1961. We haven't studied Indonesia on the show, and we definitely need to. There is a lot of material about Indonesia in the book here. One of the most important chapters is going to come after this one, and that is about the discovery of gold, the discovery in 1936 of what appears to be the largest deposit of gold ever found. And it is in New Guinea, part of the Netherlands, New Guinea, and therefore the object of the Rockefellers' greed, as was the Baku oil field, which is the subject basically of tonight's reading. Now, this chapter is long, so we're not going to get through the whole chapter tonight, but I think it's going to be very much worth it as well for folks that have been following George Webb's work on what's happening in Louisiana in terms of preparation for a hit on Castro and how Lee Harvey Oswald was involved and how that turned, unfortunately, into the hit on President Kennedy himself. That all involves Mohrenschildt, as he was the mentor of Lee Harvey Oswald and also involved in other ways. But to get a whole lot of detail like we've been given here by our author, who is Dr. Greg Poulgrain, is really a treat. The introduction was written by Oliver Stone, which is also a very great tribute that he would actually write the introduction, and it's a very good introduction. I'm not going to read it because it's a summary of some things we already know, some things we don't already know that we'll learn in the book. But I wanted to just read a little bit from the end of it, and let me pick that up. There it is. Okay. So you remember from the brothers and from other books we've read about John Foster Dulles, as his foreign policy when he comes into office in this Department of State in 1952 with President Eisenhower is a complete division between us and them throughout the world. If you're not with us, you're against us. There is no neutral territory anywhere in the world. Well, that was the opposite of what President Roosevelt had promised to the Third World during the World War II, that they were going to be free, that the colonies were going to be set free after the war. And how many people from the colonies ended up fighting and dying in those wars, World War I and World War II, on behalf of the great powers? Well, of course, it was mainly the British that had the most investment in the colonies, and the British were the ones that wouldn't do it at the end of World War II. They would not let go. And so many tragedies have happened as a result of the failure of the great powers to let go of their colonies and let them develop on their own. And not to mention President Kennedy's offer and desire to help those countries and not to impose our will upon them the way that the Allen Dulles CIA crowd has done. So it's a stark difference of opinion as to how America wants to treat the world, and frankly, whether or not we want to become an empire or a nation, in Garland Nixon's words. And I think that's a good way to look at it. I think Garland had a good insight when he said that President Trump thought he was governing a nation, but in fact it was an empire, and he didn't treat it like an empire. He treated it as if it were a nation. Well, that is one of the themes of our reading from Fletcher Prouty on to this book. Okay, so in reaction to the language and actions of John Foster Dulles, third world countries formed the NAM, the Non-Aligned Movement. And one of the main countries in the non-aligned movement was Indonesia, which had fought to get free from the Dutch and wanted to be non-aligned. And that is why President Sukarno was very much respected and well-liked by President John F. Kennedy. Those two got along quite well. Kennedy visited Sukarno, and they were planning to enter into just that type of mentorship, with Kennedy having put together a package of assistance that he planned to enact in 1964 for Indonesia. And of course, he didn't live to see it done, and it did not get done. So with that background, Afterwards, the Dutch expressed surprise at how unbalanced the Americans were in favor of Sukarno. Sukarno very much appreciated Robert Kennedy's efforts. By the way, this is Oliver Stone's introduction, the last couple paragraphs. As Roger Hilsman later wrote, the Indonesian leader thought that, like JFK, Bobby had an understanding of what the new nationalisms were all about. President Kennedy now issued an order saying, with this dispute now settled, he wanted to move forward toward a new and better relationship with Indonesia. In a fair world, one with rational discourse, one without shadow governments, one with a strong United Nations, this should have been a most beneficial arrangement. Kennedy understood that Sukarno wanted to nationalize some of the imperial industries in the archipelago. The idea was to give his citizens a larger slice of their own resources, as Mossadegh had tried to do in Iran. But unlike Eisenhower, who joined with the British to resist Mossadegh's equitable sharing, Kennedy sent his trade representative to help get better deals for the Indonesian government. Sukarno was jubilant about the new arrangement. He invited Kennedy to be the first American president to visit Jakarta. He set about building an extravagant estate for him and his wife to inhabit while there. Kennedy's aim in the 1964 visit was to protect Sukarno from the British threat through their creation of the Federation of Malaysia. In other words, instead of working with the Brits against the third world country, Kennedy was trying to help that country against British encroachment, all in an election year. On November 19, 1963, Kennedy prepared the aid bill to Indonesia. He was going to sign it on his return from Dallas. That bill was never signed. As he told reporter Cindy Adams after Kennedy's death, Sukarno loved John Kennedy. The reason was because he felt JFK understood him. Starting to perspire, he mopped his brow and said, "Tell me, why did they kill Kennedy?" Without Kennedy, Sukarno lost his shield. With the enormous wealth at stake, it was just a matter of time before he was deposed. But unlike with other overthrows like Guatemala, Iran, and Congo, it took quite a bit longer for scholars to fill in the precise calculus as to how it happened. From nearby Australia, Greg Poulgrain has made it his academic goal to try to find out just what the twists and turns of the 1965 plot really were. Probably no author has explained just how pre-planned and well executed the year of living dangerously was. And that is Oliver Stone's introduction. So, Chapter 3 begins on page 45. Before I begin reading that, I want to give a shout out to our new sponsor. We have a new sponsor. It's Virgil. And Virgil has sent us a 4-pack of his handcrafted black cherry soda. And I tell you, I know a lot of you probably like, Dr. Pepper or other cherry flavored soft drinks, but you haven't had a great black cherry soda if you haven't had a Virgil's. So make mine a Virgil's. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Virgil. That's mighty fine. Well, you can't have ginger beer every night, Well, you can, but mix it up a little. Somebody asked if I got their Christmas card, and I think I have a stack of mail that's over on my table. I'll apologize. It's mail's been coming awfully late. As I mentioned the other day, I got a letter from before Christmas, and it showed up the last day of January. So anyway, I apologize. We don't have uh, house delivery here. We have to go to the post office. So once a week or so. A pink and frothy. That sounds good, Dora. Your grandmother used to make a float with black cherry soda. Yeah, I bet you it was probably as good as Virgil's. Because tell you what, this is from high class black cherry soda, top shelf. I'm sorry, I got to push the mute button. Dulles, DeMohrenschildt, and oil, page 45. Kennedy gained some insight into the extent of DCI Dulles's covert operations in Indonesia when he requested a CIA briefing paper prior to President Sukarno's visit to Washington in 1961. He was shocked by 6 years of political interference and the funding of anti-government revolt and assassination. It included special mention of the CIA pilot Alan Lawrence Pope, apprehended by Indonesian authorities in 1958. He became a bargaining chip in the New Guinea dispute and was released at the same time as the New York Agreement in August 1962 when the Dutch relinquished sovereignty. Kennedy commented that Dulles's interference had cost the United States political credence in Indonesia, and that his priority was how best to repair the damage to bilateral relations. The sheer size of the operation Dulles mounted in 1958 was enough to convince any observer of the seriousness of CIA intentions. Tallied in dollars and ranked in cost of post-war operations, Indonesia was the next largest after Vietnam, according to the CIA logistical operator in the 1958 rebellion, Colonel Fletcher Prouty. In personal correspondence, Prouty said, quote, "The Indonesian campaign was the largest special operation the CIA endeavored to do except for Vietnam," unquote. He said that Dulles had employed a vast number of operatives and utilized ships, planes, submarines, and even the Pacific Fleet. Most of the funding was on operations for the 1958 rebellion, but in addition, there was funding for radical Muslims and for assassination attempts on President Sukarno. The CIA briefing paper admitted to having identified assets capable of carrying out those attempts, but denied further involvement. In other words, it goes without saying, they were unsuccessful. For example, on November 30th, 1957, hand grenades were thrown at Sukarno in a schoolyard in Cikini, central Jakarta. A Muslim extremist group known as Darul Islam was blamed. Sukarno avoided injury at Cikini with only a second to spare when his aide-de-camp pushed the president to the ground and used his own body as a shield. He was promoted for displaying such physical and mental agility, but 6 school children and 3 policemen were killed, and more than 100 people wounded. Kennedy realized during his first year in office that much of the advice on Indonesia from DCI Dulles was premised on the belief that Sukarno's leadership was Indonesia's fatal flaw. Sukarno had to be stopped, according to Dulles's argument, because he permitted, if not promoted, communism. Quote, "Indonesia's growing vulnerability to communism stems from the distinctive bias of Sukarno's global orientation," Kennedy was advised in the CIA briefing paper. However, Ambassador Jones knew Sukarno personally and had a different opinion. Following a note of congratulations that Sukarno sent Kennedy on his inauguration, Jones sent a few days later wrote a lengthy optimistic telegram to the State Department. Quote, "Sukarno is, after all, a warm, magnetic, responsive human being. A personal relationship between the two presidents, once established, without question will lead to greater U.S. impact on Sukarno's thinking and attitudes and could exert considerable influence on the course of events in Indonesia. Dulles was pursuing regime change primarily to gain unobstructed access to Indonesia's natural resources, whereas Kennedy's strategy was to maintain Sukarno as president. JFK's policy was part of a Southeast Asian regional approach premised on reducing, not increasing, the level of Cold War conflict, putting a stop to the Malaysian confrontation, the period of conflict that started in 1963 between Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta was an essential step for Kennedy, and this made his relationship with Sukarno and with Ambassador Jones essential. At the same time, it made Kennedy's relationship with Dulles untenable. While, quote, the legend was in office as DCI, his anti-Sukarno stance was just one of several ways, the glaring example being the Bay of Pigs, by which Dulles was in the process of determining or endeavoring to determine U.S. policy. His contacts, his influence, and his experience were unmatched. Who else in the 1960s, having entered the intelligence corps a lifetime ago, had such hands-on experience that it could be said he monitored the pulse of the dying Habsburg Empire? Even when Kennedy had ushered him out of office after only 11 months, Dulles still wielded influence, as succinctly summed up in the plaque later erected in the CIA headquarters in Langley. It is located in the entrance lobby and reads, quote, "His monument is all around us," unquote, referring not just to the building he helped to design and never occupied, but also to the very country itself, the United States, which he also helped to design. A small plaque with a big statement. It was acknowledging the central role of Dulles in modern U.S. intelligence from its inception, the extensive influence he exercised as a lifetime achievement, and the central role of intelligence in the modern United States, a role first pursued by Dulles's grandfather, John Foster, in the late 19th century. Kennedy's well-known words on Allen Dulles, quoted by Schlesinger, now carry with them the eerie quality of an epitaph. Quote, "Dulles is a legendary figure, and it's hard to operate with legendary figures," unquote. When forced to resign, the, quote, legend surrounding Allen Dulles ensured he stayed in the political limelight like a national celebrity with a continuing fan club, only, in this case, the celebrity was a veteran intelligence officer with various networks in which he was the linchpin. To appreciate just how far his networking had spread, it can be said that Dulles started as a prodigy in World War I, dealing with the end of the old European empires and the redistribution of political power, and it continued right into the 1960s. Early days. As a Princeton graduate, Allen joined the diplomatic service in May 1916 and remained with the State Department until September 1926, when he joined his brother John Foster in Sullivan and Cromwell on Wall Street. Allen's first position in the diplomatic corps just before the United States entered World War I on April 7, 1917, was in the intelligence section of the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. He had excelled in university studies, but this rapid appointment had more to do with his uncle, Robert Lansing, Secretary of State, who was then in the process of establishing a secret service for the State Department, distinct from military intelligence. In commenting on Allen Dulles's early service, Schroedis wrote, "An active intelligence sharing was going on between Lansing's fledgling intelligence department and the various British services, even before the American entry into the conflict. More importantly, at this early episode, Allen Dulles was introduced at a very young age, 23 years old, to an extremely high level of sophisticated intelligence work. From the summer of 1916 through the next 53 years. Two incidents recounted here, while brief, go a long way to explaining the difficulty JFK encountered in dealing with the legend. partly because both incidents occurred when Dulles was so young, and partly because they give some idea of the shadowy underworld he was already starting to inhabit. The first incident occurred when Dulles was working in the U.S. legation in Bern, when he was transferred from Vienna once the United States entered the war. When a Czech girl employed at the legation was found to be passing information to the Germans, British intelligence showed Dulles the evidence and insisted that she be handed over to them to be liquidated. Schroeders adds, quote, according to the story, Dulles took her to dinner one night and then walked her to a location where he handed her over to 2 British agents. She disappeared forever. A second incident shows how closely Dulles was involved in clandestine intelligence while working for Sullivan and Cromwell in Europe as its top lawyer for international business and finance. The actual incident was another abduction and murder in 1930, but this time in Paris by the Soviet secret police. The victim, an émigré from the Russian Civil War, was Lieutenant General Pavel Kutepov, the former deputy of General Pyotr Wrangel, who was one of the 4 top commanders of the White Army defeated by the Bolshevik Red Army under Leon Trotsky. After the Bolsheviks toppled the Tsar in October 1917, the White Army, with Western support, engaged in a series of horrendous clashes against the Red Army for 2 years, turning the former Russian Empire into a battlefield with a death toll in the millions. From the Baltic in the west to Siberia in the east, and south to the Baku oil fields in Azerbaijan. Wrangel in the south was the last of the White Army commanders to be defeated, and his surviving troops sought refuge in Turkey. Dulles first met Wrangel and Kutepov in Turkey, the location of his diplomatic posting after the Paris peace negotiations. Allen and his wife Clover, whom he had married in Baltimore a month earlier, arrived in Constantinople on December 12, 1920. During the previous few weeks, 150,000 starving Russian refugees had also just arrived from across the Black Sea, 2/3 of them remnants of Wrangel's army. Refugee camps were spreading down the Gallipoli Peninsula. Both Allen and his wife, who was involved in humanitarian assistance, became well acquainted with Kutepov. Dulles kept in contact throughout the next decade. During this time, Wrangel died, and Kutepov settled in Paris, as did 50,000 other white Russians. Many nobles and rich families who had escaped the Bolsheviks moved initially to Germany, but then, repulsed by post-war instability, were attracted by the cultural and historical links with France. In Paris, they even started 2 newspapers, one for daily news and another for the arts. Dulles, however, did more than just keep in contact. He became the financial link for Kutepov to maintain occasional acts of sabotage within the Soviet Union. Although Dulles in 1930 was an employee of Sullivan and Cromwell, he was often hired out to the State Department, so both of his employers might have contributed jointly to these clandestine counter-revolutionary operations. However, Stalin's secret police, then known as the OGPU, were drawing the net tighter on saboteurs inside Russia by tracking down anti-communist leaders outside Russia, such as Kutepov, and their sources of funding. Paris was a center of operations in the same way that the Okhrana, the Russian secret police in the days of the Tsar, had used Paris as a base for foreign operations. At the time of Kutepov's abduction, Dulles had just arrived by ship from New York to spend 1 year in the Paris office of Sullivan and Cromwell. The level of previous contact between Dulles and Kutepov strongly suggested they intended to meet in Paris, and the Soviet secret police, anticipating such a meeting, moved quickly in a preemptive strike. The abduction occurred on the very day Dulles arrived. A carload of secret police, one of them in a gendarme's uniform, snatched Kutepov as he was walking to church on a Sunday morning. January 26, 1930. The incident caused an international furor with 3,000 protesters outside the Soviet embassy. Dulles, however, remained on the periphery. Pardon me. Interesting, isn't it, how Dulles and this guy Kutapov had established financial links already in the 20s. So when we're thinking, and I remember when we started this and we really didn't know much about White Russians, and now we've been studying White Russians now for 3 years here on this channel. And this is, to me, to somebody that has not gotten this level of detail before about Dulles's exposure to these guys in Turkey in the 20s. Well, I do find this to be very rich field to be mining tonight. Okay, and moving on, George DeMohrenschildt. The Kutapov incident highlights the need for greater security with contacts, and this became a more refined part of Dulles's extraordinary talent in the world of intelligence. He developed an ability to maintain a viable contact for long periods, sometimes decades, without that link being open to public scrutiny. Some links from the 1920s and 30s he used in the 60s. By maintaining his distance from the link, Dulles had the option of plausibly denying any personal influence. The mental dexterity and level of subterfuge in keeping a contact viable and reliable over a 30-year period in the world of Allen Dulles almost defies the imagination. In this respect, the link between Allen Dulles and George DeMohrenschildt is an outstanding example, even more so because of the importance both persons played in the Warren Commission that was charged with investigating the assassination of President Kennedy and, quote, all matters before and after that are deemed relevant, unquote. Using his contacts, Allen Dulles conducted an intense lobbying campaign for himself to be included in the Warren Commission before the actual request by President Johnson that he join. Thus, the legend became the first of 7 other members who joined Chief Justice Earl Warren in the commission. Dulles was highly influential in the process of reaching the official conclusion that President Kennedy's assassination was the work of one person, Lee Harvey Oswald. Of the 418 witnesses questioned by the commission, one of the longest was the interview of George DeMohrenschildt in Washington in April 1964. The counsel for the commission was Albert E. Jenner. At various points of the transcript, the questions and answers read like a cat and mouse game. When DeMohrenschildt was evasive, Jenner let him run, but sooner or later would return to the point. Never quite sure how much information his questioner already had, DeMohrenschildt sometimes added more detail to a previous question. An example of this was the time spent as an oil roustabout, when Jenner seemed unaware or unwilling to explore the decisive influence it had. By returning to a point that Jenner had passed over for its apparent insignificance and adding something extra of no importance anyway, DeMohrenschildt was trying to indicate his willingness to answer more fully all of the questions being put to him. He was uniquely qualified as a witness, Jenner explained, because he was acquainted with both the Kennedy family and the family of Lee Harvey Oswald, and because he had admitted to having contact with persons in intelligence. The links that George DeMohrenschildt had with both families were discussed at length, but not the links with Allen Dulles. Even though Jenner's questioning more than once peeled back history to provide the historical context where there was evidence linking Dulles and DeMohrenschildt, it was never explored. DeMohrenschildt himself later admitted that he felt threatened during the Warren Commission hearings because Allen Dulles, as a member of the commission, was present when Jenner was asking the questions. During the 1964 hearings, when George DeMohrenschildt had wanted to appear open and honest in his answers for fear of being implicated in the assassination, he declared to Jenner, quote, "I don't mind, frankly, when you don't have anything to hide, you see. You are not afraid of anything." Nevertheless, he did keep some significant details hidden from his questioner, but these were oil-related and linked with Allen Dulles, and did not at the time seem related to the investigation. Yet 13 years later, he was far more open. In a book he had written entitled, quote, "I'm a Patsy," written after Allen Dulles had passed away in 1969, DeMohrenschildt described Dulles's presence at the 1964 hearings, saying that, quote, "Dulles did not interfere in the proceedings, but was there as a distant threat." George DeMohrenschildt is not suggesting Allen Dulles would have disrupted the questioning had he disliked the answers. Rather, he is saying that his answers were compliant, and Dulles's presence, not just during the questioning, made sure that they remained compliant. In 1964, the testimony given by DeMohrenschildt became part of the conclusion the commission reached. But in his manuscript, DeMohrenschildt disagreed with the outcome of the Warren Commission, which simply blamed Oswald. This was a Dulles-directed conclusion. In effect, DeMohrenschildt's book was challenging Dulles's influence on the commission and on him, so he was asked as a witness again, this time by the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, which in 1977 was re-examining the death of Kennedy. Before the HSCA declared its findings, DeMohrenschildt had already written his manuscript stating that the Warren Commission was wrong about Oswald. Two journalists contacted him. One was the Dutch journalist Willem Oltmans. The other was Edward J. Epstein, who was interviewing George DeMohrenschildt for Reader's Digest magazine on March 27, 1977, just when the HSCA requested he appear as a witness. Epstein noted that DeMohrenschildt now said he had, quote, done favors for the CIA in return for business favors and opportunities for his own oil business, but that he'd never been on the CIA staff or on the payroll. Who knows what he might have admitted as a witness before the HSCA? On this point, Dulles' own words to Walter Lippmann, even though uttered many years earlier, never did ring truer, quote, "The mere disclosure that a particular person is working for us may destroy an entire operation," unquote. Dulles and Lippmann both started in intelligence during World War I, but in the 1950s their friendship foundered on the issues of covert political action and the role of intelligence in a democracy. On the afternoon of March 29th, 1977, George DeMohrenschildt apparently shot himself. Dutch journalist Willem Oltmans had known him personally. They had traveled to the Netherlands together. Oltmans always regarded his death as murder, not suicide, to prevent his evidence being heard by the HSCA, and so did DeMohrenschildt's wife. Both George DeMohrenschildt and his wife Jeanne were Russian émigrés, children at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1962, they were living in Dallas as part of a Russian community of about 500 émigrés, drawn together by their culture, anti-communism, and employment in the oil industry. In the 1940s and 50s, George had established his reputation as a consulting petroleum geologist, having started in the oil industry in 1941 as a roughneck or roustabout, so he explained to Jenner. In 1962, George and Jean DeMohrenschildt, quote, befriended, unquote, Lee Harvey Oswald and his Russian wife, Marina. Because the mere name Lee Harvey Oswald can evoke such a strong result response as the alleged assassin, I should say that the following details on Oswald are included only to set the scene for the involvement of George DeMohrenschildt. Oswald, as a 19-year-old Marine, had worked in Japan on a CIA base that handled high-tech U-2 spy planes. In October 1959, he defected to the Soviet Union, living in Minsk, which was a city that George used to know as a teenager. Jenner accepted this as a reason for how George DeMohrenschildt came to know Lee Harvey Oswald, without showing clearly that their meeting may have involved some arrangement by the CIA and might be described as one of the favors done for which George was paid, not in cash, but in reciprocal business opportunities. Lee Harvey Oswald married Marina in April 1961, but then returns to the United States with his Russian wife. Oswald experienced none of the hassles one might have expected after defecting to the other side during the Cold War, then returning home. George and Jean DeMohrenschildt first met Lee and Marina when the Oswalds were living in Fort Worth, and later they moved to Dallas, which had better prospects for employment. Lee had not finished high school, but was a self-taught radical whose political views did not blend with the Russian community in Dallas, such as his approval of JFK's civil rights stance. He was fluent in the Russian language, spoken and written after only 2 years, and had read many of the well-known Russian novelists. Yet, in an unguarded moment in an answer to Jenner, DeMohrenschildt described Lee as a hillbilly. Jenner was looking for an intelligence link behind the initial befriending of Oswald, but the revelation about the favors was not revealed until the interview with Epstein in 1977. Quite apart from the fact that in November 1963, DeMohrenschildt was in Haiti, a decade later he was still pleading his innocence of any prior involvement in the assassination through his befriending Oswald. George was in the right place at the right time to be tasked with befriending Oswald and his wife, Marina, after they had returned to the United States. Only later did George seem to realize how his befriending of Oswald in 1962-3 implicated him as an accessory, and how Allen Dulles was willing to use him as a pawn, as was Lee Harvey Oswald. Before DeMohrenschildt went to work in Haiti, a party was arranged in Dallas around Easter of 1963 by 2 of his friends who were Standard Oil employees, as were most of the party guests. It was clear to Jenner, and DeMohrenschildt agreed, that the real purpose of the party was to allow others to meet and befriend Oswald and Marina. The Warren Commission transcript revealed that Oswald was on the point of starting a new job in another part of Dallas when, as a result of the party, a job was arranged for him in the Texas School Book Depository, the building from which he allegedly shot the president. This was arranged 6 weeks before the assassination. Allen Dulles was in Dallas 5 weeks before the assassination. He had been invited to talk at the Dallas Council on World Affairs, of which George DeMohrenschildt was a member. According to Zrodis, Dulles joked in private, quote unquote, about the timing of his talk, as if it might later be seen as linking him in some way with the assassination. Dismissing this visit to Dallas as a mere coincidence was, of course, a natural assumption by all of Dulles's associates because he was beyond reproach as the icon of U.S. intelligence. His own jocular referral to the possibility of being involved in the assassination is surprisingly like a subconscious admission of the animosity between him and JFK. This was well known, as was Dulles's sense of humor, so his presence in Dallas in that crucial time frame before the assassination must have seemed a balanced explanation at the time. Nevertheless, if the Warren Commission had been informed about Dulles's link with DeMohrenschildt over several decades, such a link may well have led to his disqualification as a member, and instead his inclusion as a witness. Yet the Dulles legend won the day, and he was appointed to the role of Grand Inquisitor, giving him, in the now haunting words of JFK on the day he dismissed Dulles, quote, an almost unique role. Pre-war oil was the link. The link between Allen Dulles and George DeMohrenschildt began 4 decades earlier, so we need to turn the time frame back again to Constantinople in 1920 to 21, where Dulles, 27 years old, was appointed first secretary. His orders were to work on getting a peace treaty signed with the Turks to help American oil interests, particularly Rockefeller's Standard Oil, to secure concessions held by the Turkish National Oil Company. He was also to keep watch on the Russian border with Persia and Turkey. Rockefeller oil interests in the Russian Empire were in jeopardy after the Bolshevik takeover. The most productive oil fields were at Baku, on the shores of the Caspian Sea, in Azerbaijan, relatively close to Constantinople. Baku had long been a source of wealth for the Russian royal family, generating a throng of local oil magnates, and by the start of the 20th century, more than half of the world's supply came from Baku. Pitted against Rockefeller were 2 European industrialist families, the Rothschilds, one of Europe's most prominent Jewish families, and the Nobel brothers. As well, Henry Detterding, the head of Royal Dutch Shell in the Netherlands East Indies, appeared in Baku in 1913. From his oil rivalry with Rockefeller in the Far East, Detterding had grown stronger after staving off Standard Oil takeover attempts. Pardon me. The time was propitious for some big oil deals. Rothschilds, in exchange for their Baku holdings, became one of the largest single shareholders in Royal Dutch Shell, along with Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, then the richest woman in the world. Similarly, even as red and white armies clashed, Standard Oil increased its holdings by adding half of the Nobel oil interests in Baku. Both Detterding and Rockefeller were gambling that the Tsar would retain power. They transplanted their old rivalry from the Indies to a new location at Baku. After control of Baku changed from Turkish troops to British, Standard Oil, then Vice President Walter Teagle, had purchased half of Nobel's holdings in Brandnoble Oil, Russia's largest oil company. The purchase had started in 1919, but continued even after April 1920, when the Bolsheviks took Baku and nationalized the oil fields. Rockefeller and Teagle still regarded the Russian Revolution as a temporary setback. Allen Dulles' task of lobbying for Standard Oil involved negotiations with the director of Nobel interest in Russia, Baron Sergius Alexander von DeMohrenschildt. Born in Russia of German and Swedish ancestry, the inherited royal title from Queen Christina of Sweden, Baron Sergius was one of a few special appointees responsible for mobilizing the Tsar's army. This important role further highlights the fact that oil discussions with Dulles were inseparable from strategic military concerns, and neither had promising prospects despite Western support for the Tsar, at that time numbering 250,000 men. Working in Baku with Sergius was his older brother in an executive position, and living with Sergius in Baku was his wife and 10-year-old son, George, born in 1911, the same person who befriended Lee Harvey Oswald in 1962. George's brother, Dmitri, 11 years older, was already in the Russian Navy. Dmitri emigrated to the United States in 1920, escaping with his life during the course of the revolution. Sergius was arrested, but before being transported to Siberia, he escaped to Poland with his wife and son, George. They stayed on a family estate, as George later described it, which was a wooded area of Poland right on the border with Russia, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 acres. So we were not completely penniless refugees, unquote. George's mother died soon after they arrived in Poland. After completing school at 18 years of age, George volunteered to join the Polish cavalry for 18 months at a famous military academy where the Polish nobility displayed their ability to ride horseback. Endeavoring to get the record straight, or perhaps with a touch of arrogance, he added, quote, "And I was the best, if I may say so." It was mid-1930 when George went to Belgium for university study, just after the furor in Paris caused by the abduction of Kutupov. Stalin's secret police were then headed by V.R. Mezhinsky, a former member of the Polish nobility who had lived in the United States, Belgium, and France. At first, George studied in Antwerp, in one of the oldest commercial institutions of higher learning founded by Napoleon. Then he did 4 years of study, and after each year he visited his father in Poland. Sergius was well known among the émigré community, and no doubt by Medzhinsky too, as a former appointee of the Tsar and one who had mobilized the army. Personal security was an abiding concern for Russian émigrés during the 1930s. It is well known that Trotsky was murdered in Mexico in 1940, but less well known that many of his family, including his son, were murdered in Paris in the late 1930s. This was the time of the terror under Stalin, when many millions of Russians were liquidated inside the Soviet Union. Beyond Europe, the Russian Revolution spread as an émigré diaspora far and wide to China, Canada, the United States, South America, and Australia. One can understand how George and his father, more than most émigrés, must have held a lingering fear about Medzhinsky, not knowing whether he'd ever attempt to recapture Sergius to serve the prison sentence in Siberia he had so narrowly escaped. When George was studying, he also set up a business selling ski clothes and sports clothes, which involved traveling. "Did you then travel through Europe?" Jenner asked, and DeMohrenschildt replied that he did. Of course, Paris had a ready market with émigré customers who knew Sergius, but this was just a preliminary job before 1938, when he too emigrated to the United States, where he changed the von in his surname so it became DeMohrenschildt. He would have little trouble gaining entry to the United States because one of his early ancestors, as Jenner pointed out, was born, quote, "somewhere in Pennsylvania," unquote. More than that, he was a lieutenant or captain in the American Army of Independence, and then went back to Europe and died there. So Dulles and DeMohrenschildt each had a forebear involved in the same historic struggle against the Redcoats, and now the Reds were the common enemy. Again, as both Dulles and DeMohrenschildt were 20th century archetypal anti-communists. Well, I think we'll have a lot more detail about what they did next when we continue reading from chapter 3, Dulles, DeMohrenschildt, and Oil, of this brand new book, JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia, by Dr. Greg Poulgrain, and with the introduction by Oliver Stone. Well, I hope you enjoyed the reading tonight. I certainly did. No, it's not Meginsky Act, Rose. It's Medzhinsky, which is the Russian Secret Service guy, a very scary guy indeed. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, Harley Schlanger. So we'll pick up Harley Schlanger's ideas as to what to do next in this crazy world. And he's got a lot to say. So I look forward to that. 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, right here on McDuff Lives. And thanks again, Virgil. You done good.